Way over to Genesis, the very beginning of Genesis. We'll be mostly in chapters 1, 2, and 3 tonight, but we'll kind of do an overview. We're going to be jumping all around the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, but we'll kind of start over in Genesis. But I want to join in the welcome for everybody here, and especially if you're visiting. We're very glad that you're with us tonight. And I'll also echo what Lawrence said this morning. It's so good to be back. I was out for a while. I was out for a couple weeks. I went down to help out at a summer camp down in the Houston area. And then I went to a friend's wedding. And by the time all that was over, I finally got to come back here. But while I was away, I was talking with someone about just where I was bouncing around to. And then I realized, I said, and then I'll go home to Bowling Green. And it just kind of hit me. I called Bowling Green home. So I guess that's a good sign. I've really loved it here at Lost River. It's coming up on a year that I've been here now. And I'm so thankful for each and every one of you and the constant encouragement and support that you have been to me and that I know that you have been to one another. So I just wanted to say that as we got going. But tonight, I'm excited about this series that we're going through. It's short, but I'm excited because, to be honest, it's something that as someone who grew up in 21st century education, I think I take for granted that this is our Father's world. And I just want to be completely honest about that. I don't think I appreciate God's creation in the way that I should. When I see the sun, moon, and stars, when I see the trees, when I see the rainbow in the clouds, I don't know that it hits me as much as it should, or like I wish that it would, and that I believe that God has intended his creation to hit me, the language of creation. And so I'm excited about this, and I hope that these studies maybe open our eyes and open the eyes of our heart to appreciate more deeply the way that God has spoken to us, not only in his word, but in his world. And tonight, the specific aspect of creation, the symbol that we're looking at is trees. And so I want to toss out just an easy question as we get rolling. What comes to your mind when you think about trees? That's a really simple question, but just to get the ball rolling, what comes to your mind when you think about the significance of trees? And I'll do my best this is the biggest class I've ever taught, so I'll kind of scan the crowd, make sure I get everybody. But what comes to your mind when you think about the significance of trees? Maybe in the Bible, or maybe just, I don't know, through something else. Oxygen, right? So they provide life in that sense. That's one way. What else? Provide shade, right? I think about like the story of Jonah specifically. But yeah, they provide shade. What else? Yes. They're strong, yeah, especially the deeper the roots, the stronger the tree. I remember when I was growing up, I don't know if this is going to be an embarrassing story or not, but when I was in like second grade, a terrible hurricane was about to come through the Houston area. And I remember before I left, second grade Jarrett walked up to my favorite tree that I would like climb in and everything, and I prayed that the tree would stay standing, and it did. It was a big old oak tree. It had these firm roots, and it stayed there. Now we eventually cut it down, and it was just a stump, so the story isn't it has a bad ending. But yeah, trees they're strong, right? Yeah, so what else? What else about trees? I'm sorry, what was that?
For animals.
Yeah, it's a home for animals, and sometimes for us too. In fact, and maybe this goes into like the cutting down part of it, but sometimes, right, we make homes out of trees, and that'll come into play in a second. But anything else about trees? Oh, okay, I see a bunch of hands now, so we'll just keep going. Yes, sir.
They're designed to bear fruit after their time. A tree that did not bear fruit after its time is something that was worthless.
Right.
They were typically cut down and thrown away. The tree would bear fruit after its time.
Right. Yes, sir. So trees, they bear fruit. So they're not only a source of life in the sense that they emit oxygen, but they provide a source of sustenance, fulfillment. I think about Psalm 1 that was read this morning, the one who is planted by a stream of water that yields fruit in its season. I think I saw one hand in the back, and then maybe we'll go with one more in the middle. Yes, sir? Oh, he stole it from you. Okay. Then was there one in the middle that I missed? Okay, yes, sir.
Beauty in every season.
Beauty in every season. Absolutely. Just looking at the beauty of trees and appreciating it for what they are. A couple of interesting things about trees in the Bible as we get going. Well, let me pause and actually say this first. I think trees, to the ancient readers, especially over in the Judean, Galilean countryside, or even before that, what would have been the land of Canaan, trees would have, maybe more than anything else, represented a source of life. And that was mentioned in at least two answers. But you think about this arid, dry, desert-like region. Wherever there's a tree, that means that there's a source of life and abundance. And usually the tree is going to be toward the top of a mountain or something where it gets some of the dew and it's a little bit cooler up there. And all around this tree would be all kinds of life of animals, fruit that maybe comes from the tree. But to the ancient reader, I think what immediately would have come to their mind when they think about the significance of trees would be that it's life. Life is everywhere around a tree in that kind of region. But a couple other interesting things about that. Trees are mentioned, they're the third, what's the best way to word this? They are the third most commonly mentioned living thing in the Bible. So there's God, there's man, and there's trees. That's how common trees are talked about in the Bible. It's over 1,000 times that this word is used in the scriptures. And so you could turn to just about any page on the Bible, and you're probably going to read something about a tree, or it's going to be somehow connected to the story of the Bible. But also this word tree that's used, it's the word eitz. That's how you say it, eitz. It's the same word that is used for any form of tree. And so this gets back to what I mentioned before. If you chop it down, if you burn it, if you build with it, if you carve it, it's all the same word, eitz. And I don't know that I'll directly allude or directly mention that again throughout the rest of the study, but I do think that's kind of helpful to keep in mind for how this word tree is used in Scripture. In any form that wood or something like that is mentioned, it's the same word. And the biblical authors use it in such a way as to draw our attention to that. So maybe that sounds a little obscure right now, but I think that'll come together in a second. And so let's start with this then. What's the most well-known tree in the Bible? Maybe one of two. What's the most well-known tree in the Bible? I hear a bunch of tree of life. Yeah, tree of life. Yeah, the tree of life. And I typically picture the garden. Of course, the tree of life is there in the garden. It's there in Genesis 1, and it's in Genesis 1, or it's mentioned in Genesis 2 directly. And then at the end in Revelation 22. But I typically picture the garden as this flat area, very fertile, and maybe, I don't know, if you close your eyes and you picture the Garden of Eden, I don't know what would come to your mind, but I kind of usually picture something flat. And maybe that's not totally wrong, but it's interesting. Genesis 2 and verse 10 talks about how the rivers flowed out from Eden, which would mean just like the picture that you would get in the ancient world of where trees were, it's on a high place. The rivers are flowing down out of Eden. And so Eden is more of a high place. And at the top of this high place is the tree of life. It's right there in the middle. And so you have a tree planted at the top of a high place, and that kind of becomes a dominant motif throughout the rest of Scripture. And we'll see that more in a second. But as we think about this tree of life, what's so special about this tree? What's so significant about this tree of life? Okay, so there's the tree of life, and then there's also the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which we'll get to that in just a second. What do you think is so significant about the tree of life, though? Do y'all find anything in the text, or maybe that's mentioned even later? What do you think is so special about this tree of life that's talked about here in Genesis 2? It's eternal, yeah. It provides them with this source of eternal life. And there are probably other things that we could mention along with that, but I think we're supposed to see the garden in some ways as this kind of temple, where the top is like the Holy of Holies. It's the most holy place where the presence of God is the most intense. And that is exactly where the tree of life is found. And so this tree of life is representative of God's own life that he made available to Adam and Eve through this communion. When they come and partake of this tree, they're partaking of God's life. And this life, I think, is more than just about quantity. It's more than just about the number of years that you live, but it's about quality, the kind of life. It's about what it really means to live, what it really means to be alive. It's not just about physical existence, about just having breath in your lungs, but it's about the quality of it. Because when Adam and Eve, when they eat of this tree, they're partaking of God's own life, and they're changed, they're transformed into his divine image. And so life is found in communion with God. That's what the tree represents. That's what the tree of life is all about. It's life that is found through communion with God. When they partake of him and his divine nature, it changes them. And so that's this tree of life. But there's another tree in the Bible, and that's what was just mentioned, right? And that is the tree of life, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what do we know about that tree? Well, what do we know about the tree of knowledge of good and evil? They were forbidden to eat of it, and if they eat of it, they will die. That's what God tells them. And so here's this tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what else do we know about this tree? What does Eve see in this tree? Right. Yeah. She sees this tree, and in this tree, the fruit that's hanging from this tree of knowledge of good and evil, it's good for food. It's a delight to the eyes. It draws you in, and it desires to make one wise. In other words, it's almost an alternative source of life. It's saying this is where life is found. She looks at this tree and thinks, man, maybe that's what I'm missing out on. Maybe this is the life that I really need to partake of. And you notice there, what's interesting is it seems side by side. You have the tree of life, and right next to it, or at least just down the way from it, is this other tree, this false tree of life, this tree of knowledge of good and evil. Or some translations talk about the tree of knowing good and bad. And they're right next to each other. And so the picture is, every time that Adam and Eve are to go and to partake of this tree of life, they have to walk right past the tree of knowing good and evil. And it's like this test. And the test is this ultimate choice of, am I going to find life by partaking of God and of his nature? Or am I going to try to find life by taking it into my own hands and defining good and evil for myself? Will I receive the gift of God's own divine life? Or will I choose to take of a lesser kind of life out of my own knowledge of good and evil? And so, of course, we know what they choose, right? They're driven out of the garden. But as they're driven out of the garden, I want to ask, what thoughts and emotions do you think they must have felt as they stood there at the edge of Eden? I don't know if you've ever thought about that before. It's something that I've thought about recently. I think maybe a song or a hymn was what kind of triggered my thoughts about this. But I don't know how often I step into their shoes and think about what it would have been like to step outside of that garden and to stand there at the edge of Eden and just all of the thoughts and emotions that must have overwhelmed them. So what thoughts and emotions do you think they must have felt as they stood outside the garden for the first time? Yeah, so devastation is something that they would have felt, being apart from God's wisdom. There in the garden, they were able to walk among the presence of God as he was there in the cool of the day. And through that relationship, they were supposed to understand what it means to continue God's creation. They were to understand what it really means to live and to be a human. And through that relationship, that's where they gained wisdom, and now they're separated from that. And that's devastating. What else do you think would have been going through their minds as they stand at the edge of Eden? So shifting blame, not my fault. Yeah, certainly they do that to begin with. Adam and Eve both shift the blame, Adam to Eve and Eve to the serpent, which makes you wonder if they had owned up to it, would the story have played out differently? Who knows? But yes, what else?
Seeing the cherubims guarding the gates makes it kind of, you're not going back.
Yeah, there's no way that I'm walking up to one of the cherubim and they're standing there seeing this thinking there's no way back. And just the hopelessness that they must have felt in that moment. Any other thought? Outcast. Yeah. Outcast, wandering, that becomes a dominant theme throughout Scripture too. The theme of the exile as they're cast out from the presence of God and wandering in this new wilderness that is full of thorns and thistles and struggles and toil and sin. But I think one question that must have immediately dawned on them, if they had any sense of hope at all, would have been, how are we ever going to get back to the tree of life? Maybe you would have wondered something different, but as I try to put myself in their shoes, that's the question that just reverberates around my mind. How are we ever going to get back? Or maybe not me, my descendants, I don't know. How are we ever going to get back to the garden? How are we ever going to get back to the tree of life? And so through this sense of hopelessness and despair, they're wondering this question. And of course, we know how the story ends, right? We have Revelation 22 that talks about how it's paradise restored. The garden is restored. Eden is there again, and the tree of life is on either side of this river, and it's just like it should be. But in this moment, as they stand outside the garden, they don't have the full picture. They're wondering, how are we ever going to get back to the tree of life? And isn't that the question that everybody's asking? Maybe they don't even realize they're asking that, but isn't that what everyone's searching for? They're searching for life. They're searching for what it really means to live. And some people, maybe that is quantity. How can I live forever? But everybody is searching for that quality of life. Everybody is wanting to partake of that blessed life. Everyone is searching for that. But here's how that plays out in the Bible story. At first, it seems pretty dark and hopeless, right? Chapter 4, Cain is presented with a choice just like Adam and Eve. You can take of the tree of life, or you can take of your own way, the knowledge of good and evil. And as he's met with this decision, as sin is crouching at his door, what does he choose? He chooses to kill his brother, Abel. First murder, first death. Chapter 5, it's this long sort of genealogy, these descendants, but over and over and over again, it says, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. And I don't think it's just about the genealogy. I think it's the writer's way of saying, look at the consequence of sin. It brings death. over and over and over again. That's what you see throughout that chapter. And then by chapter 9, it's so corrupt. Mankind has descended so far from taking of this false tree of life and this tree of knowledge of good and evil and taking it for themselves, that the thought of evil is on their hearts continually. And God sends this flood, and maybe in the midst of that flood, the physical garden that we know of from Genesis is gone. And you think, how is this ever going to be restored? It just seems like this picture gets darker and darker. But sort of in the background, as all this continues, there's this sort of promise whispering, right? And what is that promise? I know that's a little bit obscure of a question, but as mankind delves further and further into despair and disaster, what's the promise that is just faintly whispering in the background through this all? Genesis 3 and verse 15. I'll go ahead and read it. Through the darkness, through the despair, there's this promise that's still hanging in the background. And that's Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you, speaking to the serpent, and the woman, between your seed or offspring and her seed. He shall bruise your head, or crush your head, I think the NIV says, and you shall bruise his heel. So as you have this constant downward spiral all the way to the flood and then seemingly beyond that, you have this promise in the background about the seed of woman. And I don't want to make too big of a deal about this, but I don't think it's any accident that it's described as a seed. From the very beginning in Genesis 1 in the creation story, God there through the writer is trying to create this parallel between people and trees. Trees bear fruit, humans bear offspring. There's a parallel that runs throughout the rest of the Bible around that idea. That's why the psalmist writes that in Psalm 1, that people are like trees. He's like a tree planted by streams of water. But I don't think it's any mistake that it's called and described as this seed. There's this seed that's there, and it seems so small, and there doesn't seem to be any life yet, but it's growing. It's going to grow into something that will get us back to the tree of life. And it's the seed of woman that will crush the head of the serpent. And this seed of woman is really going to do two things. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but the two things that this seed of woman is going to do, it's going to accomplish, is one, he will pass the test to the tree of life. That's the idea. He will say no to the false tree of life. He'll say no to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and he'll take hold of the tree of life. And in that, the second thing that he'll do is he will reverse the curse of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, who will reverse the curse of death and sin and all the things that came from this choice there in Genesis 3. And so you could think you could almost picture it like this. This is how I kind of picture it in my mind about what's going on in the biblical story. It's like you have this tree of life, but it's been chopped down. It's been taken down to this stump, just like the tree that was ground to a stump outside my house growing up. It's just this stump, and it seems hopeless. It seems lifeless. It seems like nothing is really going to come from it. But all along, there's still this root. And every now and then, this root shoots up above the surface, and it brings us hope, and it points us back to this promise from Genesis 3 about the seed of woman that's going to bring us back to the garden and bring us back to the tree of life. And so, what are some of the characters? We think about this root that shoots up throughout the biblical story. What are some of the characters that point us back to this promise about the seed of woman? And if you can, maybe we can even think about it chronologically. what are some of the characters here after Genesis 3 that point us back to this hope about the seed of woman who will bring us back to the garden? Abraham would be one. And remember what I mentioned earlier about how the picture there in the Garden of Eden is you have this tree that's planted at the top of a high place. And that continues throughout Scripture, and that happens in all of these stories over and over again. And you see that especially in the story of Abraham. Time and time again, if you just read through his story, you find him at high places, you find him around trees, you find him around trees at high places. But the story that seems to shine through the most is when in Genesis 22, he takes Isaac, his son, up to the high place, to Mount Moriah. And on the shoulders of Isaac is the axe, the wood, that he carries to the top of this high place that then becomes the altar, becomes the wood that he's burned, that he would have been sacrificed on before God stops him. And so you have this picture again, getting back to the garden. You have a high place with a tree at the top. And Abraham is right there in the middle of it, pointing us back to the garden. What's another character that might point us back to that scene? Abraham is certainly one. Can you think of any others, maybe just before Abraham? Noah. Yeah. Noah also becomes this sort of new Adam. The world becomes corrupt. God sends the flood, but the next time that the word "ates" appears after the tree of life in the Bible is Genesis 6, when God comes to Noah and tells him to make an ark of gopher ates, of gopher wood. And that tree comes to rest after the destruction and chaos. It comes to rest at the top of a high place with all of the animals that come out of it 2 by 2. And there he plants a garden at the top of it. It's Eden all over again. And this happens several other times throughout the Bible story. We'll just mention just a couple more. Moses and his life. As he's this shepherd out in the pasture, he comes to Mount Horeb, which is also known as Mount Sinai or the mountain of God. And God appears to him where his holiness, in fact, it's the first time the word holy is mentioned in the Bible, in Exodus 3, when his presence is there in the burning bush. And it's echoing again back to this tree of life, back to this promise that it's going to be restored through the seed of woman. And then there comes, he brings the people to Mount Sinai, and they construct this tabernacle at the Lord's command that symbolizes Eden, with the menorah and the Ark of the Covenant echoing back to that same tree of life. And then, of course, David comes along and he says, God, let me build you a house for your name and for your glory. And he's not allowed to build it, but Solomon does, and it's built out of cedar. He builds this house, this dwelling place for God. And in fact, when David initially asked God if he could build him this house, he says no. But then he says in 2 Samuel 7 that I'm going to build you a house. And he says in 2 Samuel 7 verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your seed after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom forever. And so over and over again, you hear this echo of the promise that even as humanity reaches these dark valley moments, all along there's this promise that we're going to get back to the tree of life. We're going to get back there one day, and God is just whispering that throughout the Bible story as this root comes and shoots up above the surface and reminds us of this hope of restoration and communion with God again. But just as this promise seems clearer than ever before in the story of David, and in 2 Samuel 7 and verse 12, with this promise of this seed that will come, just as it seems more clear than ever before, what does Israel do? Do you remember what their number one problem was? Or at least top three? Remember what the number one problem with the people of Israel was, especially as they began to settle in the land? Worshiping wood. Idolatry, right? They take these false trees of life and they put them at the tops of high places, and it becomes a world full of idols. And isn't that what we so often do? We try to get back to the garden by these false trees of life. And we think, if I can just keep taking from this tree, then this is what it really means to live. That this is what I can find fulfillment and life in, that this is what I've always been searching for. This is what will sustain me. This is the life that I've been searching for. We create these false trees on high places. And so as Israel does all of this, the land of Israel becomes this world full of idols and false Edens, until finally God decides to drive the people out, just like he did Adam and Eve, so that the true Eden and the true tree of life could be restored. And as all that happens, the prophets, they continually remind us of that promise, right? That promise in Genesis 3:15. Zechariah talks about the righteous branch through which God will establish his kingdom and build his temple. Isaiah 11 talks about the shoot that will come up from the root of Jesse and the branch that will bear fruit. Isaiah 53 talks about that suffering servant who grew up as a tender shoot and a root out of dry ground. And what all that says is this, that if God has made a promise, then there is always hope. And I don't know who is here tonight that especially needs to hear that. We all need to hear that from time to time, and certainly in every moment of our life, we need to be mindful of that. But there is always hope if God has made a promise. Even if it seems like a lost cause, even if it seems like it's just been taken down to a stump, as long as there is a root, as long as there is a seed, God will accomplish his will through it. So no matter how dark the situation might be, if there is a root, God will bring life from it. And that, of course, leads us to Jesus, the root of Jesse and the seed of woman. And you can see glimpses of the garden throughout his life and throughout his ministry, especially throughout the parables that he tells, the parable of the sower and others that he mentions. You see this theme of the garden come up time and time again, but I want to focus on one moment in particular where I think it all comes together, and that is in the cross. Because with that promise from Genesis 3, the seed of woman, you remember, was supposed to accomplish two things. The seed of woman was to pass the test to the tree of life and was to reverse the curse of the knowledge of good and evil. And so how did Jesus do that? How did Jesus do these two things? Well, the night before his death, Jesus found himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. And just like Adam and Eve, he is faced with a test. He's faced with this choice. And do you remember what he says? Do you remember what he prays in this prayer? As the conclusion of this prayer, do you remember the words that he says? Not my will, but thine be done. And as Jesus rises from this prayer in the garden saying, not my will, but thine be done, Jesus passes the test. Jesus, he walks past the tree of knowledge of good and evil to take hold of the tree of life. And as he carried the wood on his back up to that high place to be hung on that tree, his death reversed the curse of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where the one who hung on that cursed tree became our tree of life. That's where the tree of life leads us. The one who took his life up to the high place and hung on that cursed tree became for us and for all people the ultimate tree of life in which we find the source of everything. So I want to close with this. The tree of life is the bookends of the Bible. It's there in Genesis 2, it's there in Revelation 22, it's at the beginning and end, and it's this beautiful picture of what God has done and is doing and will do. But the tree of life is also mentioned in one other place, and that's in the book of Proverbs. We're actually studying through Proverbs right now in the high school class. But that's the other place that this tree of life is mentioned, there in the book of Proverbs. And there the writer has in mind not a literal physical tree, but he has in mind a way of living in which you can take hold of that tree of life. That's like experiencing right now the tree of life. And what that means for us is that we get to partake of the tree of life right now. Every time that we open this book, every time that we sing praises to our God, every time that we come together, every time that we partake of his body and his blood, every time that we walk past the false tree of life, every time that we walk past the tree of knowing good and evil, and we take hold of that tree of life, we are experiencing it right now, in this moment. Choosing God's way, choosing God's life and his divine nature apart from our own. And in that we find life. We're changed and we're transformed to be like him, or as Peter talks about, we are quite literally partakers of the divine nature, both right now and forever. So we're not there yet. We're not there to the tree of life yet. And maybe sometimes we feel just like Adam and Eve, standing at the edge of Eden, wishing we could step in, wishing that we could walk right into the midst of God's presence and it be the same fullness and the same joy and the same life that Adam and Eve experienced before the fall. But one day we will. And the leaf that's on that tree will be for the healing of the nations, and there'll be no more mourning or crying or pain, for these things have passed away. And the tree of life will be restored, and we'll be in the presence of God forever. But right now, we still have hope. We still have the tree of life when we live for him and we partake of his divine nature. As the words of John as we close, this is eternal life, to know God and to know Jesus whom you have sent. Let's close with a prayer. O Lord God, you are the source of all life and of all abundance and of all blessings. And your blessings have overflowed throughout history, throughout time, and into our world today and into our own lives. And we praise you for every one of them. We thank you for this church. We thank you for the family that you have given us through your Son. And we thank you, especially right now, for the hope that he was to all mankind to get back to the garden, to get back to the tree of life, to get back to a relationship and communion with you. Lord, please help us right now to take hold of that tree of life, to not chase after the false trees on false high places, but to come to you alone and find life forever in you. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.